To bring Dr. Divya Chander up. She's a neuroscientist, MD PhD out of Stanford. All our folks have incredible bios. Again, they're on the website, they're on the app. And Divya's going to take us into a little journey about reading and writing to our brains. Dr. Chander.
Hi, good morning. As I approach this topic, I just want to let you know within our session, we have some incredible people talking this morning about different ways to read brains. And then later in the session, you're actually going to hear about others who are writing brains. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I, as an anesthesiologist, have been reading the brain. And I'm going to tell you something else about myself. As a neuroscientist, I actually went into anesthesia because I wanted to manipulate human consciousness for a living and then study it at the same time. So what I actually do is I go into the operating room and I actually record brainwaves from all of my patients as I take them through an anesthetic. And in fact, that's what it would look like. You can see sort of a model patient with an electrode array on her forehead. And we're able to sort of hack this process of understanding what neural networks look like as we transition from the conscious and aware state into unconsciousness. You can actually see some real brain recordings actually over my left shoulder behind me in an operating room. And look at these photos here. You can actually track real patients' brains as they lose consciousness. You can see where everything goes from red and green to blue. You can track how to maintain them in this unconscious state so they don't feel the surgeon cutting into them and wake up during surgery. And then you can actually figure out how to bring them back. And over at Stanford, one of the things that we're doing is we're combining databases that I've recorded in the operating room using an electroencephalogram with people in our sleep labs and people who study epilepsy. And then we're using these databases to write new brain monitoring algorithms. We're using them to mine for biomarkers. And we're actually looking at the genetic basis for all these different neural oscillations. In fact, we're creating a drug dictionary for the effect of every drug that we administer and what it actually looks like in the EEG. So that's sort of my brief tour of reading brains. And you're going to hear a lot more about it this morning from Ariel and from Mary Lou Jepson. But let's go on to writing the brain, because what I'm here to tell you about is where the cutting edge is going. Now, many of you are familiar with this. This is deep brain stimulation. It's an older technology whereby we put electrodes into people's brains, inject electricity into the brain in order to control circuits that have gone bad. And the surgeries are done awake, as you see from this clip from the Mayo Clinic, where you actually have a violinist who is playing in the operating room. And what they're able to do is actually track his tremor using a bow with a 3-axis accelerometer in it. And as the electrode goes in and as they're injecting current, they can actually watch the tremor go away and his violin playing improve. Now, the problem with deep brain stimulation is you're sticking an electrode into the brain and it's generating this spherical electric field. So you get the desired effect within the electric field, but you also get a lot of undesired side effects. And so another technology was developed. And that technology is called optogenetics. And I did my postdoctoral work with Karl Deisseroth at Stanford in optogenetics. Let me explain briefly why it's so much more specific. So DNA has actually been modified and taken from microbes that phototax to light. And that DNA is actually using sort of gene therapy trickery injected into neurons that actually have an address tag. And so you can specifically target certain neurons, have that DNA for these light-sensitive protein channels transcribed and placed on the membrane. And you can now inject light into the brain onto those neurons and activate these neurons at will. You can also, depending on which light-sensitive ion channel you use, actively silence the brain. Now, this is far more specific, but as you'll see in this screen capture from Karl's website, it also requires an invasive implant, much like an electrode. This is just a fiber optic wire that comes in to actually control and deliver light into the brain. And a group of us, after we left Karl's lab, a group of postdocs, we wrote a paper on optogenetic brain interfaces and what the future was going to look like. This was in 2014. And as you can see, almost every single device that we put up there is invasive, right? And that's a problem, because if we're going to help most of humanity, we need to find a way to actually modulate brains without cracking open skulls, because most people are not going to want to consent to that kind of brain surgery. So there are other ways to now begin to modulate the brain from the outside. So the key is, how do you get energy from outside the skull and have it penetrate the brain and then modulate what is on the inside? Now, what I had shown you before are light-sensitive protein channels that we delivered into the brain. What if we could deliver protein channels that were responsive to pressure? And in fact, that is what this group at the Salk Institute did. They actually took the DNA from a pressure receptor that encodes touch, and they put it into a worm brain. And now, when you see this round worm is moving in one direction, there's an ultrasound that was applied to the outside of the worm, and it's now able to manipulate those genetic channels on the inside of the worm's brain and change the direction in which it moves. So we're slowly beginning to move into a realm in which we can actually modulate the brain from the outside. Now, this was just published this year. This is a new device developed in the Salk Institute. It's actually a nanoparticle. And what these nanoparticles do is they're seated throughout the brain, and they can respond to infrared. Remember, I said the secret is, can you get energy from the outside through the skull and into the brain? And what happens is that these nanoparticles take infrared light, and they they upscale it, and they turn it into blue light, which can now directly modulate those protein channels that have been infecting these neurons. So you have a new way of specifically controlling neural circuits within the brain using infrared from outside. Now, the holy grail has always been to use these devices to create brain-machine interfaces. Now, Lee Hochberg was with us a few years ago, and he actually founded the BrainGate Consortium. And if any of you have time, it's actually really worth looking to see what they've done. But essentially, they have a grid of microelectrodes that sits on the motor cortex of patients. And these are patients who are paralyzed. Many of them are quadriplegic, so they've basically lost sensation and motor function from the neck down. But they can think just fine. They can make planning movements just fine. And what they've done is to implant these electrode arrays within the brain, and they use now, these things intercept the thoughts of the patient, and you see in this particular set of photographs, this particular patient, who is a quadriplegic, is using her mind to control a robotic arm outside herself to bring a carafe of coffee to her mouth, okay? So this is kind of an amazing thing, people using their thoughts to control actuators in the real world. Similarly, last night, I believe you saw a clip from the University of Pittsburgh where this work is being done. There's an array implanted in this man's head, but it's not in his motor cortex, it's in his somatosensory cortex. And what that allows him to do is that robotic arm, which President Obama is shaking, he can feel the sensation of Obama shaking his robotic arm as if that arm is attached to himself, because those brain signals are actually going into his sensory cortex. Now, the key here, again, is how can we actually make this kind of thing less invasive? So there's new research that's been coming out. This is from Australia and the University of Melbourne. Does anybody know what a cardiac cath is? Basically, if you have had a heart attack and we need to bust open a clot, you can go into a lab where we use basically a series of high-intensity x-rays just to image the vessels. We make a tiny little incision in your groin and just pass a catheter up there that can be tracked through a vessel, right? And it can bust open clots in the heart. It can actually be used to put coils into brain aneurysms so people can stop bleeding. But we do it with a little bit of conscious sedation, a little bit of numbing medicine. This is not major heart surgery, brain surgery. Well, this group had the great idea, why don't we take the cage that we normally thread through that vein, and let's thread it with electrodes. Why would we do that? Because you can actually get that electrode cage through a vein into a vein that overlies the motor cortex. In other words, you can deploy a brain-machine interface via a central vein into the brain. So let's see how that works.
Hi everyone, this is President Barack Obama. The US and Australia are funding research into a device that could someday allow people to control their prosthetics with their minds and without invasive brain surgery. When implanted into a blood vessel, this network of tiny electrodes can record your brain signals. Technology that has the potential to transform the lives of our wounded warriors and others with disabilities.
So we're moving to a place where we can actually deploy brain-machine interfaces non-invasively. Take a look at another one. So this one's out of Berkeley, and it's called neural dust or stim dust. What you see there, and it's tiny, it's a piezoelectric device. And what these devices do is they actually take energy from one form and transmute it into another. So this particular device actually takes sound waves or pressure waves and turns it into electricity. And here you see the most recent version of their device, and it's actually sitting on top of a peripheral nerve. It's wrapped around it using a cuff. And what the device does is it actually takes that piezo crystal, takes sound waves from the outside, so it's acting like the antenna, and it actually converts it into electricity to stimulate the nerve. So one day they're hoping that they can see the entire central and peripheral nervous system and gain access and control that way. Now the thing to remember is, again, you do still have to get inside the brain in order to spread neural dust. Can we get completely non-invasive? And here there's a series of technologies coming online. One of them is something called focused ultrasound. And I think Salim just made mention of ultrasound, but this is a way to get focused sound waves into deep structures in the brain. You can actually do surgery using focused ultrasound, but you can also modulate brain circuits using ultrasound. Another one is applying electricity to the outside of the skull. And the electricity from the outside induces electrical currents on the inside, much as transcranial magnetic stimulation, so delivering magnetic energy from the outside of the skull can induce electrical currents on the inside of the brain. So this is an interesting concept. So this also just came out recently this summer from the MIT Media Lab. And actually they were able to develop a series of small devices that no longer need any sort of power or battery control. They're controlled by radio waves. So you can now modulate the inside of the brain from the outside using radio energy. Now the question is, have these devices shown any promise? Well, transcranial magnetic stimulation has actually been approved by the FDA for refractory depression, so depression that doesn't respond to drugs. And it's actually been very, very helpful in taking people who have suicidal ideation and actually reverting them to a state where they no longer have those kinds of thoughts. Another major issue, Alzheimer's disease. I don't know if you realize this, but the very first blood tests to detect early Alzheimer's disease have finally started coming online. But we haven't had anything to do with this data. We don't know what to do with it. So the study that Salim was referring to is right here. So this summer, Incytec, which is a device that delivers focused ultrasound, just got FDA approval to actually apply this to the blood-brain barrier. What's really interesting is just a few weeks ago, the very first patient was tested using focused ultrasound. And the idea here is that they're going to disrupt the blood-brain barrier in order to drain beta amyloid plaques that have been thus far really hard to get to. Here's another really interesting application of non-invasive technology to treat Alzheimer's. This was also published this year. And this comes out of MIT from Dr. Tsai's lab. And they had originally used optogenetics to try to dissolve Alzheimer's beta amyloid plaques in mice. And what they found is they not only could dissolve those plaques, but they improved their performance on learning and memory tasks. But most people, in fact, we have an aging population. Many people are going to be developing Alzheimer's disease simply because we're living longer. And most people don't want a fiber optic implanted into their brain. So with Ed Borden and with one of my mentors, Emory Brown, they got together and decided they would try to mimic the optogenetic stimulation in parts of the brain using flashing lights from the outside going through the eye, and noise being delivered through the ears. And they found that they were actually able to similarly dissolve Alzheimer's plaques. So these are the very first two treatments that have come online for Alzheimer's disease, and they're both coming from the sphere of non-invasive neuromodulation. So they've founded a company now specifically to work on non-invasive neuromodulation for the brain, and they're not the only ones. So we're finding now that rather than DBS, you can use non-invasive neuromodulation to treat Parkinson's disease, even to treat things as difficult as migraine headaches, which causes an enormous amount of morbidity in the United States and elsewhere in the world. We also had Kate Rosenbluth come a few years ago to talk about her company. There are entire companies that are coming online whose entire focus is electroceuticals, treating the brain with electricity delivered from the outside. But the holy grail here has been this. How many of you have wondered, can you stimulate your brain from the outside and get smarter? Is anybody interested in that, right? The whole augmentation movement. Guess what? You actually can. In fact, some of the very first studies have been published in the last 5 years showing that non-invasive stimulation from the outside can improve things like learning and working memory. This study was actually done with magnetic stimulation, the prior one with electrical current. And the key was, are these changes long-lasting? So this study actually found that you can use electrical stimulation, and I kid you not, you can deliver random noise outside the brain to the brain, and then have your subjects do an arithmetic task. They not only perform better, but the effects last and persist for up to 6 months afterwards. And transcranial direct current stimulation has been even used to do things like improve sports performance. And why is this important? Because it's created an entire movement. Now, you're going to see some of these devices in our demo area, but companies like Halo, they're actually trying to use direct current stimulation to the motor cortex 20 minutes before athletes begin to train to improve their motor performance. I know for a fact Hum is back there, and again, I'm not making endorsements for any companies, but I'm trying to let you know that this entire movement has really started. This is actually to improve your working memory, and Think, who was here a couple of years ago, originally started by trying to use non-invasive neuromodulation to improve mood and sleep. But there is a caveat, and this is where I'm going to close. There's an entire DIY movement here. Check this out in MIT Technology Review. This guy is basically telling you that you shouldn't be trying this at home, but hey, I'm going to refer you to a kit where you can build your own transcranial electrical stimulator from the internet. And this is Reddit, okay? Did TDCS give me dyslexia? Things that could go wrong with a simple setup. I read somewhere that a 9-volt battery could kill me if one of the electrodes pierced the skin or was placed on an open wound. That should be easy enough to avoid. And I love this one. Read this. I'd like to try TDCS. Anyone in San Francisco want to zap me? Look at the one at the bottom. Help me summon the courage to mount this beast. This was sent to somebody in the mail, this device, and they're trying to figure out if it's okay for them to put it on and zap their brains, all right? Just saying. I'm going to close with a really funky approach and application to non-invasive modulation, and that is connecting brains. The very first telepathy experiments have been done using non-invasive neuromodulation. Here's one of them in 2014. Basically, a subject is using an EEG cap to actually send thoughts to a subject receiving it. Doesn't matter if they're in the next room or in another country, as long as there's an internet connection. That guy has a transcranial magnetic stimulator at the back of his head. It's receiving the bits of information being sent and stimulating the back of his visual cortex to generate phosphenes so he knows whether the bit's a 1 or a 0. And just a few weeks ago, just last month, the very first 3-person telepathy social network was set up to play Tetris together using a really, really similar approach. And so I'm going to leave you with this thought. We're getting to an age, and you're going to see a lot of that in this morning session. Will connecting humans to machines fundamentally alter what it means to be human? So with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I will be around all day. Thank you.